Welcome to the first of what we hope to be a series of Earth Science Frontier talks. This is hosted by the School of Geosciences, but also the Earth Science Cluster here at Wits University. It's a brainchild of an amalgamation of departments, institutes, and schools in the Faculty of Science, and mainly the School of Geosciences, the Geography, Archaeology, and Atmospheric Science, and several other departments, including paleontology as well. And the idea behind these talks is really to host seminars, discussions, allowing our scientists and our students to engage in thought-leading discussions about new ideas in the earth sciences. And as we were talking about when we arrived, several of us haven't ever met each other. And so I think we have to have more discussions like this. Of course, there are many people in the room here in the School of Geosciences, but there are many of you in the audience joining us on Zoom and on YouTube. So thank you for joining us. And you will be welcome to ask questions and joining the discussions towards the end of the talk. So we're going to have two talks in this particular Frontier series. And the first will be 30 minutes long, followed by the second. And then we'll have at the end 15 minutes for discussions and questions. And if we want to, we can go on for longer. We have plenty of drinks in the room, so we can have engaging discussions and talk about some of the ideas and the synergy that we can develop within this Earth Sciences cluster. So the first speaker tonight is Professor Craig Sheridan. He is from the School of Geography, Archaeology, and Environmental Sciences, and he's the Claude Leon Foundation Chair in Water Research. And he's also the Director of the Center for Water Research in the university. He's actually an engineer by training, and an interesting part of his CV is that he did his MSc at Stellenbosch in wine biotechnology. He's not going to talk about wine tonight, but rather water. And it's fantastic to have you, Craig. So thank you so much, and we welcome you to this. I'll just get my screen up here. Okay, I think everyone can see you. Your screen is sharing, and you'll just have to either press the arrows and point. Over to you.
Thanks, Grant. So I always want to caveat, please don't hold it against me that I'm an engineer. Rather treat me in some special way as a consequence of that. Tonight I'm going to chat about coupling the circular economy to an historic linear waste production process. And the idea about this is, how do we start getting circularity of processes and of things, which is what we need for environmental beneficiation, onto these old-fashioned linear processes. And as a chemical engineer, that's really what I specialize in, is process engineering. So obviously, the one I have a lot of experience on, and that I'm going to actually use as the example, is mining. I'm going to talk about its waste and the impact of that waste on the water resources. We're all in this building. It's the Geosciences building. Geosciences, metallurgy, and mining engineering are the origin of Wits University, the history of the university, the history of Johannesburg, and South Africa is deeply linked to mining. It's the history of many of our families. So there's a lot of history around mining in South Africa. To give you some of that context, the goldfields upon which we've based this history have provided more than a third of all the gold seen in the world today. That's an astonishing amount of gold from such a small region. It's a really astonishing statistic. But not only that, we're also ranked 7th currently in the world for coal production. So this is also, it's a big number. These are not small statistics. These are economies of scale that are around international trade flows. So the extraction of both coal and gold and others have had immense economic benefit to South Africa. But with that economic benefit has come immense environmental degradation, which is ongoing. And we all know about this. This is not new. So how do we get the gold? And this is, I have to go through the processing in order to talk about the circular economy. But this is a typical gold mining process. It starts off with an underground activity. It's brought to the surface in the stockpile. You have crushing, making it just a bit smaller. You have milling, you have a leaching of some sort. This is a heap leach. You can have leaching in tanks. You go through some kind of a separation process, and you have another separation process. You add something like zinc, which precipitates the gold out. Do a little bit more filtration, and suddenly you're left with your gold. That's what we're doing. So that's great, but what this is a linear process, and you can see very clearly it starts from one thing and it moves its way through the process. It's a linear trend. The materials follow a line. There's something else missing from this process flow diagram, which is the water. So process engineers love using water to transport things, but it's not very often part of our mass balance because it's really not what we're interested in. Not when I say we, that's a generic we for process engineers, not me personally. I'm very interested in water. But when you're doing your accountancy across your plants, you're not including the water because it's not the value. The value is the gold or the coal or whatever else you're looking at. So often it's excluded from this entire process. And because it's excluded, it's not really a part of the thinking process of the engineers that design these processes. It's something that's there and it's always assumed to be there and it's always available. Coal mining, this is also a wonderful process flow diagram for non-chemical engineers. But really what you do is you start off with, in this case, an open pit coal mine. You dig out the coal, you put it through lots of shakers, you have screens and conveyor belts, and then you go through a washing plant, which uses water to wash over the coal, and the coals have different densities according to the different grades. And because of this, you can separate the coal out into different qualities. And that's what these three different piles are here. You have metallurgical coking coal, you have thermal coal, and then you have this like reject stockpile. And again, roughly speaking, this is a linear process. Within the process, there are a number of recycle loops, but if you look, there's not a lot coming out of it. There's the whole, and there's the three stockpiles. So again, where is the water? It's not shown in this. So again, the thinking of engineers is excluding things like water, which for me is problematic. And then we have the consequences of mining, and especially in South Africa, we have sulfide-rich ore bodies. And the primary consequence of this is acid mine drainage. So at the end of the lecture, I have a bottle here, which we can have a bit of a show and tell, and we can put the camera on it so people can see what AMD looks like. It's nicely sealed. Please don't drop it or we're all in trouble. Okay, because I haven't done the risk assessment. But it's great talking to geologists because you know this, like coal and gold ore bodies in South Africa are rich in sulfides, especially iron sulfide. For those who don't know what iron sulfide is, it's fool's gold, it's iron pyrite, it's a nice gold mineral. It reacts very, very quickly with water and oxygen, and this can be mediated by microbes or not. It doesn't necessarily have to be mediated, but it follows these three reactions. And I want to take a moment just to go through them, even though there may be non-technical people in the audience. Start off with pyrite, you add oxygen, you add water, you make this substance called ferrous iron. Ferrous iron is Fe2+, it's like a greeny blue color. You make a little bit of sulfate and a little bit of H+. H+ is the acid. What you then do is you take this ferrous iron and you react it again with oxygen and with some of this other acidity, and you make ferric iron. So you're oxidizing this ferrous iron to ferric iron. And this is what people typically see when they see acid mine drainage in rivers or whatever. It's called yellow boy. It's a bright yellow sludge or substance that moves through the rivers. This ferric iron is not our friend because this is the one that reacts with the iron sulfide and a little bit more water, and then we generate 16 hydronium ions. That's the acid. So that's what's causing the really great damage to the environment, because that acid you have to now do something with. So the numbers are not that important. What's really important is the 16H+ as a consequence of this train of reactions that feed off each other and they loop through each other. And this results in a highly acidic, low pH solution. And I've used both those words because not all acidity is hydrogen acidity. You have mineral acidity. This is both. It's highly acidic, it's low pH, and this has the potential to mobilize heavy metals. It's a significant risk to human and ecological receptors. The acid dissolves many metals, not just heavy metals. It can dissolve all sorts of things, and it mobilizes them into the environment. And many of these metals are toxic, and they can include things like nickel, copper, lead, manganese, arsenic, aluminum. I could go on. Okay, I don't need to. And that would really depend on the geochemistry of the ore body. An example, I always like to use copper as an example. We use copper in all our pipes. You wouldn't think of it as particularly hazardous. Every single person who uses True Blue or one of these chemicals in your pool, the pool doesn't have algae growing in it because you're putting copper in it. Not the chlorine-based ones, the copper-based substances. It's highly toxic to certain plants and animals. So whilst we think it's fairly benign, it's not. Under the right conditions, it's extremely not benign. It's really toxic. And metabolically, a lot of this involves the things in your body, the enzymes. You have something like a nickel or a selenium atom filled with these really cool proteins all around it. And if you start slipping the wrong things into that metal in the middle of your protein, you die. That's why they're contaminants and they're dangerous at such low concentrations in the environment. It's to do with the chemistry of living systems. So it's not great to have these things wandering through the environment. Also, it's really costly to treat. It's a never-ending sink of post-mining revenue. There are certain places in the world that are still impacted by acid mine drainage from the Romans. Like it's 2,000 years later, and you've still got these heavy metals coming out of some of these old mine workings. So it's not something that goes away. And that's what it looks like. So as you can see, there is no life. This sample comes out of that lake. And that's why I'd like you to have a look at it. It's quite beautiful in its own right. But as a researcher, it's quite beautiful, not as someone that's worried about the environment. So we've got lots of barbed wire saying, don't go in there. This is it's a dangerous location. So now I told you about acid mine drainage and how you get there from mining and the legacy we have. And we have lots of abandoned mines, we have lots of closed mines, we have lots of mothball mines, and we've got this problem across many of these sulfide-based ore bodies, especially where the minerals have run out. So what is the circular economy? This is from the EU Parliament webpage, but most manufacturing processes that we talk about nowadays follow what they call a linear economic model. And this relies on cheap, easily accessible materials. It relies on cheap energy. It normally includes planned obsolescence. So I had a review team, planned obsolescence, for those who don't know, is things like light bulbs can be designed to last for 100 years. They're not. They're designed to last for 2 or 3 years so that you buy a new light bulb because that's the revenue to the company. That's called planned obsolescence. So there are lighthouses in like observatory in some of these suburbs from the 1920s that still have their original light bulbs that still work. That's what we should be aiming for if we want to work in the circular economy. The cost to the environment is externalized almost always on these linear economic models. So what that means is that the commons accept the environmental liability and the producer doesn't really engage too much in it. And we see that now with many environmental spills or whatever across many parts of the world where the state has to step in and clean up. And that state is actually you and I. It's our tax money. So whilst we have in theory polluter pays principles, in practicality, who owns the JCI liability for Robinson Lake? And there are agreements that would tie that back to whoever it is, but it gets a little bit fuzzy, and ultimately that becomes a common liability. So what is the circular economy as a contrast? Is a model of production and consumption, both and, which involves sharing, leasing, reusing, repairing, refurbishing, recycling. It's a way of extending the life cycle of your products. The idea is to keep waste to an absolute minimum, and it's got what's called cradle to cradle design. So what that means is when the products reach the end of life, the reuse has already been considered in the design of the original product. So it's not now, okay, now we've got some plastic, what do we do with it? Oh, let's send it off to the recyclers. It's that plastic has a specific purpose, and it's designed to be a feed for either another process or to come back into your process. So that's really important. And ideally, this will create a long-term value chain. So it's not just like in, through, out. It's into the value chain, and then you keep it in there and you're circulating this value chain. And this is quite alien for us as like people to be thinking. It's not our current economic or thought processing in the way we do things. So this is a graphic again from the EU Parliament website, and this shows what the circular economy is. You start off with raw materials and recycling, both and, not either or. In your design, you're supposed to be including both of these at that stage. You have production and remanufacturing, not just manufacturing, distribution. This is important, use, reuse, and repair. I have a toaster that I'm going to have to throw away because the handle broke off. That should not be. Like, I don't need to throw my toaster away because the handle broke off. I should be able to repair the handle. So the EU is, I really like the EU. They're great at pushing this. You then have collection and you have recycling. And the idea is that you have this, you may have a residual waste component, but ideally not. Ideally, that residual waste should be feeding back into either this loop or some other loop. So let's try and get rid of this residual waste. And that leads to a complex question, which is what happens to current industries, such as mining, which have very large capital-intensive footprints? How do you think in a circular economy way for a mining company? How do we incorporate the circularity within a linear framework? And how can we use these concepts to think about waste and or remediation of wastes? So for that complex question, for me, the challenging lies in figuring out how to couple the circular economy onto this stream. And we believe this can work for the treatment of acid mine drainage. And the way to consider an answer to this is akin to a linear gear mechanism. And that's what this schematic shows, is you have a waste stream, which is linear. I cannot change the linearity of how acid mine drainage is produced, but you can use that linearity to drive a circular economy concept where you can potentially generate revenue from this linear waste stream. And I'll show you how we want to do that. So this very long title is about trying to remediate this acid mine drainage from that very toxic dam through replacing some of these like raw materials with alternative substances or alternative feedstocks. So I want to just go a little bit on how acid mine drainage is made, especially at this site. We have a coal waste rock dump. Rain falls onto this, and for hydrogeologists or hydrologists or groundwater people, you have a phreatic surface inside, and you typically have a toe seep at the base of the waste rock dump. And that toe seep, because you have sulfide, you have air, and you have water, you generate acid in this coal waste rock. So this starts to become acidic. And at the site, they didn't really know what to do with it, so they put it into a storage dam in the hope that a solution could be found. And they're still hoping, and it's many, many years later. And then what they did was, because no solution was coming, they repumped it back onto the top of the waste rock as a way of like keeping it on the site, because you can't have this overflowing into the environment. If you wanted to treat this, it's very possible, it's very doable. There are many technologies. You could put up a high density sludge process, like we have on the West Rand for the Western Basin, or even the Central Basin or the East Basin. And basically what you do is you add lime, you set up a process, you get pH neutralization. So you get some kind of clean-ish water, and I use the word ish because you're limited by the solubility of gypsum. So you still have quite a lot of sulfate in there. It's still too high to really put into the environment safely. And you've got a lot of sludge, because all of that lime makes this metal-rich sludge. What do we do with the sludge? So in the West Basin, they're putting it back on the tailings dams because we don't know what else to do with it. If you wanted the clean-ish water to be really clean, you can do other things. You can do biological processing. That DSR stands for dissimilatory sulfate reduction. You can get microbes, and they will eat the sulfate if you give them some extra food like organic matter. And you can also make really clean water from that process. You could put a reverse osmosis plant here. You can do all sorts of things. And again, you're going to make with the sludge, you're going to be left with the sludge, which you have to dispose. Again, this is linear. It's a linear economic model. And instead of making money, you're actually paying a lot of money at each of these stages in order to get to clean water. So this is a cost that's externalized to this source of generation of this cost or this environmental liability. And if we want to treat it, we have to pay money to do that. And the problem is that clean water is not very valuable in South Africa. So we're paying, I don't know, it's like 12 Rand per 1,000 liters for clean water. If you have an RO plant, you can get away with economics at about 20 Rand per 1,000 liters per cube. That's the economics of doing this in this process. And that means that if you're generating 10,000 liters per day, you're going to be paying quite a lot of money. If you're generating 100,000 or 1,000,000 liters per day, you're going to be sitting with a bill which is there forever if you follow this economic model. So we say, okay, let's have a look at some of those nasty dollar signs. What can we do? So the first is, let's replace the lime with something called BOF slag. Okay, so in the steel production process, you add limestone as a flux. What this does is it absorbs some of the impurities and it prevents oxidation. And typically we produce in this country about 1.6 million, 1,600 million tons annually of this BOF slag. That's what it looks like. It looks like gravel. It's really like a stone. And what's nice about BOF slag is it's got this high calcium oxide content. For those of you who do chemistry, that's lime. It's there, it's alkalinity, it's available. So we know we can use that. We've done a lot of research. We know we can get this out. So then we said, okay, maybe we can do something else to get the water from cleanish to clean. Maybe we can replace our organic substrate with another waste product. And in this instance, we used sugarcane bagasse. So in the sugar industry, you take your sugar, also another nice linear industry, you take your sugar cane, you grow it in the fields, you fertilize, and then what you do is you squeeze the sugar canes and you extract different things at different stages in the process. So you start with free run sugar, and then you get through to the real end bits where you're trying to extract things like blackstrap molasses, those really bitter, malty things that you can buy for funky breads. And what's left after that, if you want to sell them for artisanal breads, there's a good circular economy. But when you're finished with that, you're left with this fibrous mat of stuff, which is basically the residual cellulose. And it turns out that there's still quite a lot of sugar in this, and there's a lot of cellulose and a lot of hemicellulose and a lot of lignin and some other extractives. So this is quite a nice replacement for something like an expensive organic feedstock. So for dissimilatory sulfate reduction, typically you want ethanol, which is expensive. So we did the research, we can use this, it's great. So we said, okay, let's design a process around this. And we have acid mine drainage, we have slag, we have sedimentation, we have our sulfate reducing bacteria, and we have a treated water tank. So we start up with startup water, and I'll explain why now. We pass it through the slag chamber, and as it goes through the slag, it dissolves the alkalinity. So basically we're dissolving some of this calcium oxide, and this is now a high pH stream over here. This sits at about 11 or 12. We can get the pH up to that high using a waste product. And just as a sidetrack, to reuse the slag in the building industry, they irrigate it with water to wash out this alkalinity because it causes volume instability in concrete. So you don't want it in your concrete because your buildings break apart. But if you can get the alkalinity out, it's a really good substrate. So we're saying we want the alkalinity, you want that. Maybe we can talk, we can make a plan. So you then have this alkalinity and you blend it with acid mine drainage, and you put that mixture in a sedimentation vessel. Once your pH is more circumneutral, and I say circumneutral because it can be anywhere between about 5 and 8, according to the chemistry, you start to precipitate most of your metals. Your iron precipitates, most of your heavy metals are not soluble at these high pH values. And then they drop out, and then you pass this clean-ish water, because this is no different to the high-density sludge process, through the sulfate reducing reactor with bagasse. And actually what you get out here, if you're clever, you don't get any gases, you get iron sulfide precipitate, And if you wanted, you can make hydrogen H2S gas, rotten egg smell, but that's a little bit toxic, so we're not sure we want to do that. And then that comes out here, and what we were able to do is we were able to get this to environmental discharge limits through this process. So now you have treated water, and you send that off, and then you recirculate that back to the slag chamber to carry on this lime dissolution process. And at the same time, you start adding fresh AMD. There we go. So the animation didn't work. This arrow is supposed to disappear at that point. And the reason you want to do this is you don't want to add the acid mine drainage directly to the slag, because as it sees the alkalinity, it precipitates and it armors the surface. And then you can't get to the alkalinity. So it just clogs the whole thing up. So the idea is you change that, and you then have this recirculating loop of treated water or being treated water generating the alkalinity and your precipitation. And then what we have is this taught me about the difference between engineering and science, because for me, this is a lab scale reactor. It's about 150 liters in these different tanks. And I'm speaking to my chemistry colleagues, and for them, a lab scale reactor is maybe a liter, so I realized we think in different scales, but the chemistry is the same, nonetheless. But that's what it looked like in the laboratory with the different buckets containing different things. We've got the anaerobic digesters with the big gas over here. There's some of your precipitation things, and that's your slag beds. And these are the results that we found. So this is sulfate, and we were able to get 99% of our sulfate out of the process. This acid mine drainage had a sulfate value greater than 15,000 parts per million, 15 grams per liter. It had a pH of about 1.92, and it had 3 grams per liter of iron. So it's really, really high concentration AMD. It's not like the stuff that bubbles up out the ground here. It's much, much more concentrated. And this is some of the metal removal. We got 98% of the aluminium out. Calcium, we have an increase, obviously, because we're leaching calcium from our slag. But typically, we were getting between 80 and 99% of our metals out of solution. So this is quite good. And as I say, we got to discharge limit, which is really nice. It's not what I aim for. I typically aim for plant water quality, because it's really costly to put your water back in the river. It's generally costly to do that. And then, because I'm a chemical engineer, we designed a process, and that's a typical process flow diagram of this process. And I'm showing you just so you can see what it looks like. And that's what it looks like in the field when we went to pilot scale. So it looks fairly crude. It is fairly crude. It's got like little tubes that run from point to point, and it's got a couple of peristaltic pumps. We had more challenges in the field. We had load shedding issues. We had a laptop in one of these buckets. And of course, whenever you load shed, then you lose connectivity with the Wi-Fi, with the 3G dongle, and we couldn't do our process control because we couldn't manage it from Joburg. So it was a real challenge. But even within that context, we were still at scale getting 85% sulfate removal, 80% iron removal. And that's because of this low pH that we were able to achieve. Ideally, we'd like that to be higher, to be more surface neutral. But that's okay. The proof of concept is that it works. So those are the different vessels. And then the question was, so where to from here? Because again, it's not proper circular economy. This is about thinking maybe slightly differently. It's more about valorization of waste. So we said, okay, let's do something else. So we still have our sludges to dispose, even if we were offsetting the costs through replacing our raw materials. So we reassessed the process, and it turns out for the same reason that AMD is so hazardous, it contains a lot of value. It's because it's an acid that's able to leach minerals from an ore body, whatever that ore body tends to be. And it turns out that it contains significant concentration of rare earth elements and other valuable metals when we started to look for all of these things. What are rare earths? They're used primarily for electronics. Some of them are also used in ceramics and a couple of other things. China is the primary supplier. they supply 90% of the global rare earth market. So they are now called critical metals, and globally there's a lot of interest in how do we diversify our source of rare earths, because China's sitting on this this monopoly. They are a monopoly. So it turns out, because we're talking rare earths, there's quite a lot of interest. And these are some of the things that we're talking about. It's things like cerium, europium, struggle to say these things, gadolinium oxide, neodymium, scandium, and yttrium. So we have quite a lot of scandium. We have 6 parts per million of yttrium. We actually have quite a lot of these things. These are the ones that I know we have in our acid mine drainage. And the idea is, well, if we've got these things in like parts per million concentration, that's not very different from gold, which is sitting at parts per million in solution or in ore body either. So actually now we're in the economic bracket where we can start to think about extracting this as a resource. So potentially that awful looking site is $100 million resource that we can start to exploit and think about exploiting if we're thinking carefully. And what we did was we then, we got rejected 3 times, but we eventually got a Danita grant. So this is about tenacity, and like if you get rejected, try, and again, and eventually get your grants. But we said, what can we do? So we said, let's take high value. We're calling it now high value AMD. We can do load shedding? No. Was it load shedding? Okay. So we are still screen sharing and we still have participants. So we can do things like ion exchange, and there are methods to do this where you can start pulling out selectively, and we want to do this. How do we get these rare earths out in a form that we can send for other forms of extraction? We then have high value rare earths. Suddenly, instead of putting dollars into our process, we're thinking about pulling dollars out of our process. We have a low value AMD. And it turns out that acid is what you use to make biofuels if you want to tap into things like cellulose. So cellulose is a really strong compound. It doesn't like to be broken down. And that's why cows have 3 stomachs and they move it backwards and forwards, is because they're continuously trying to break the cellulose down. It's not easy. So it turns out if you put acid on the cellulose, it does break it. It cleaves all of these polymers into simpler sugars. And you have something like an organic residue. And it turns out, and we've done this in the lab, we know we can actually make ethanol from acid mine drainage treating grasses, which is really exciting because now we're talking biofuels and reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. This is now a subject of considerable debate in our project because it may turn out that it's better to put this into a biodigester and make methane, because you can run generators off of methane, for instance. We're not sure, but that's what's great about research, is we don't have to be sure. We just have to have an idea that we can test. And again, we have this final iron-rich sludge over here, and that maybe we can send back to things like the steel mills or the iron refiners, because it's got what they want. At 3 grams per liter, if we're treating 10,000 liters per day, we're making a considerable amount of iron ore. It may be that we can't sell it to them, but maybe they would be able to take it from us and put it into their into their furnaces with their raw materials. So it's around this concept of no more waste. And out of this, for me, the waste product should be clean water. That's the waste. If you're doing your processing properly and you're extracting the value, your waste product should have no value, and that would be clean water. And then we can use it. So this is quite a nice project. It's got an environmental economics component where people are valuing it. I wish I could say that I knew exactly how they're going to do it. They don't. I know some of this stuff, and we have a consortium team, which is what's fun about this. But I think what's important is to show these, and I didn't do this on purpose. I only discovered this 2 days ago when I was putting this presentation together, is the similarity between the circular economy concept and what we're trying to do using acid mine drainage as a driver onto the circular economy concept. And I think the challenge is just, how do we think differently about doing things that we can use these ideas and retrofit them to what we have already? And that's pretty much what I wanted to speak to about today. And this, just because I'm a chemical engineer, I wanted to come back to the process flow diagram with that little gear, showing again, this is your acid mine drainage. It's the linear gear through the process to clean water. and we're generating the value through the circular economy inside that. So, yeah, it started off as a project and ended as a program. So I have a lot of acknowledgements, all of those people, and also some of the funders and other collaborators. And I'd like to just acknowledge their effort in no particular order. It's as I remembered it. So that's my presentation for today. I was going to have questions, but we'll do it afterwards. We'll do that.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you very much. That was fantastic. We're going to save the questions for the end, I think. And we're going to move straight on to the next talk. And I should say right now that these talks may seem unrelated, but the point of these frontier seminars is to try find synergies where many of us think they don't exist. And so the point is to see what research people are doing and to try and synergize and think about ways that we can share research ideas and develop new questions in the earth sciences. And so the next speaker is Professor Francois Engelbrecht. He's a distinguished professor in the Global Change Institute, which is a very important part of the earth sciences cluster, which I forgot earlier. So please don't feel left out, Francois. The earth sciences cluster hosts several departments and institutes at Wits Geosciences. Francois is a distinguished professor there and leads the Global Change Institute and is a lead author on several IPCC papers, intergovernmental panels and climate change papers. And as you'll see from his talk, is a climate modeler. And we look forward to hearing about some of the research that we potentially can do and collaborate on. So we'll get your talk up, Francois, and think about tipping points. So here we go.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ron. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really great to be part of our launching event, talking about all the research happening within the Earth Sciences cluster in the Faculty of Science here at Wits. The Global Change Institute is indeed the latest addition to the cluster and also to the Faculty of Science. We work in the Wits, we were based in the Wits Research Office in earlier years, some of you will know. So yes, this is going to be quite a different talk. It is going to demonstrate a diversity of what happens in the Earth Sciences cluster at Wits. But I can already give a hint that the common ground with Peg's excellent talk is going to be that valueless product he mentioned right at the end, namely clean water. So keep an eye open for that. I'm going to talk about an aspect of climate change we really need to think about carefully in Africa, namely tipping points in regional climate systems. I'll soon explain what that means. But in a nutshell, it's about unprecedented changes, things that may happen that we've never experienced before in the historical past. But to systematically give you an introduction to this, let's start by looking at today's satellite picture before we start talking about the more distant future. So that's what's happening right now. I downloaded this image just about an hour ago, just before coming to this venue. And you can see to the south of South Africa, a large cold front just brushing over the Cape South coast. Those cloud patterns you can see south of South Africa, that's so-called cold air cumulus cloud behind the cold front. And so far this winter, we had a good number of frontal systems making landfall. Everybody here in Johannesburg would have experienced some of these systems reaching us. We were even at 1 or 2 rainfall events in Gauteng this winter, which is not common events. Those darker areas in the satellite image, those are areas that are currently cloud-free. And that's normally how it looks like in the winter. A cloud-free interior with the fronts just managing to reach the Cape South coast. So part of what I'll talk about today is the future of these cold fronts. In a warmer world, can we still rely on them reaching us in the southern parts of the country, the Western Cape, the Cape South coast, bringing our winter rainfall? This is a look back at what happened on the 11th and the 12th of April. So this is an important satellite picture. It shows there, just southeast of Lesotho, the weather system that caused these absolutely devastating floods in Durban and surroundings. Now, if you look carefully at that image, at least the meteorologist will identify something really strange, namely that in the center of that cloud pattern, there's a dark area, which means a cloud-free area in the middle of the storm. Now, that's a feature that we usually see only in one weather system on the planet, namely the tropical cyclone. That's the eye of the storm. And for the very first time in recorded history, to the best of our knowledge, and I've already cross-checked this against many of our region's experienced climatologists, we had a weather system that produced an eye-like feature south of 30 degrees south. So this remains to be published and peer reviewed, but as far as we know, it has never happened before. So what makes this so unique is that the Durban floods was caused by a so-called weather system of the mid-latitudes, so-called cutoff low pressure system. It developed over the Atlantic Ocean, moved across South Africa, and when it reached the Indian Ocean, it changed its characteristics, and it became a tropical type weather system. So this is how the weather system looked like on a weather map. So the Durban floods are the plot there on the right-hand side. That was the weather system on the 11th of April, before it moved into the Indian Ocean. That's a well-known weather system in South Africa. Weather forecasters would immediately recognize it as a cutoff low. We get about 10 of these systems every year in South Africa. 2 out of 10 bring floods or damaging rainfall. That's not uncommon. So some of the audience members here today will remember the Laingsburg floods of 1981. My students, of course, never know about what happened back in those days, but Laingsburg was a cutoff low. 1987, September, the Durban floods. It was the very same system. You can see it there on the left-hand side plot. And just 3 years ago, we had a similar system, also a cutoff low. It was also devastating floods in Durban. About 180 people died in the cutoff low induced floods of April 2019. The September 1987 floods, I think too few people realized that about 500 people died back then in those floods in the Durban area, which is more or less the same number of people that lost their lives earlier this year. So this type of weather system, a cutoff low pressure system and the flooding that it brings, this is actually not an example of a classical climate change induced tipping point, the type of event I'd like to talk about. These things have happened in the historical past, and we really should have been prepared for what happened in Durban. So the Durban flooding cannot in the first place be attributed to climate change. You can't say that climate change caused the Durban floods. So there's a case to be made that climate change intensified what happened by forming that tropical type circulation on the 12th of April. So that is a research case that the Global Change Institute is currently formally pursuing. But first and foremost, the flooding was the result of the losses of life, the terrible losses of life we've experienced. That was the result of our unpreparedness for an event that has happened several times before in the past. It's in the first place about zoning. Too many people live in KwaZulu-Natal, right along the banks of rivers that become mighty rivers during periods of heavy rainfall, such as the Ngeni, or along steep hill slopes, where it is well known that mudslides occur when the soils become saturated. especially if the vegetation is depleted. So we've recently reflected at the Global Change Institute, together with colleagues at the International Center for Security Studies, on the causes, the underlying causes of these events. And just in some publicly published compositions for now, that I've provided the links there on the screen, if someone would like to have a read. But now, back to this topic of tipping points in the regional climate system. Let's have a look at our projected climate change futures, starting by having a look at changes across the globe before we zoom into our region. So these are maps that we constructed for the IPCC Assessment Report 6 published last year in August. And you can see that in these images, we are depicting regional changes in temperature as a function of the global change in temperature. So we are depicting a regional temperature change as a function of the level of global warming. For example, the top left slide shows a world that has, on the average, warmed by 1.5 degrees Celsius. That is what global warming means. It's the average warming of the planet at its surface, and the baseline climatology against which the warming is calculated is the so-called pre-industrial temperature, which we approximate in IPCC and generally in climate science with the period 1850 to 1900, because that's the period, that's really where the observational record starts in terms of temperature. So the important thing for us as Southern Africans to realize when looking at these images is that we do not have to look any further in the Southern Hemisphere than Southern Africa to find the region that is warming the fastest. So in Botswana, just to our northwest here in Johannesburg, the warming that has occurred to date is well more than twice the global rate of warming. So there are parts of Botswana where temperatures are already a staggering 3 degrees Celsius higher than 100 years ago. Here where we live in Johannesburg, the average temperature is already 2 degrees Celsius warmer than what it's supposed to be. And that should be compared to the global warming to date, which the IPCC assessed last year, was for the period 2011 to 2020, 1.1 degrees Celsius higher than the pre-industrial average. So across much of the Southern African interior, the warming is about twice the global rate of warming. So we say we have a very strong climate change signal in terms of temperature. Now, if you look at those maps in the middle, they show something that should let the alarm bells ring in terms of potential tipping points in the regional climate system. They show that should global warming continue in an unmitigated fashion, and should it reach values of 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, we are now at 1.2 in 2022. The temperature change in Southern Africa will be well above 4 degrees Celsius. And in these 4 degrees Celsius worlds, well above 6 degrees Celsius, the regional warming. And as I will show later on in the talk, this will induce a number of irreversible changes in the Southern African climate and ecosystems. But I'll get to that. Let me first point out the next important piece of this puzzle. What's going to happen to our rainfall patterns? And this is the third assessment report in a row that has assessed that the Southern African region is likely to become generally dry. And as you can see on these maps, that's quite exceptional. Most regions in the world are projected to become generally wetter as global warming intensifies. And the basic reason for that is to be found in thermodynamics. The warmer we make the atmosphere, the more water vapor it can hold, and the more water vapor is eventually available to form water droplets in clouds. And precipitation is indeed already observed to be increasing over the world's land masses on the average. But there are a few important exceptions, and the Southern African region is one of those exceptions. So the subtropical parts of the Southern Hemisphere are likely to become generally dry. Now, that's the main reason, in combination with the increasing temperatures, why the Southern African region was already identified as a so-called climate change hotspot by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change back in 2018. Because if a region like ours, that is already water scarce, becomes drastically warmer, and at the same time dry, the options to adapt are limited. Which brings us back to the importance of managing our water resources to the largest extent possible and saving every drop that we can in a world that will become drastically warmer and likely also dry. And it's also this combination of a generally drier future in combination with drastically warmer conditions that bring the possibility of tipping points to the region. And I'll very soon get to that. Let me just bring the message home a little bit more. Now we are zooming in to specific regions using the climate modeling capability that we've set up at the Global Change Institute in recent years. Okay, this time, colleagues, it may well be. Yeah?
Let's see. I think just a tap on the screen, I hope. There we go.
Ah, very good.
There we go.
John, thank you very much. Excellent. So here we are now taking these very same projections. They have been downscaled, and we generated more detailed projections across Southern Africa. But essentially, it's the same data we are looking at. We are zooming in at the Theewaterskloof catchment, the most important catchment when it comes to Cape Town's water security. We are looking by using these different colors, we are moving through time. So the blue and purple colors, they represent 1961 to 2005. And then as we move through those warmer colors, the red dots, they represent the end of the century, 2080 to 2099. We can see on the y-axis annual temperature anomalies with respect to the baseline period, which in this case is 1961 to 1990. And on the x-axis, we are looking at rainfall anomalies, annual rainfall anomalies. So you can see in the Theewaterskloof region, if we just look at the present day period in the purple and blue dots, we see natural variability in the climate system that we all know about. Some years are wet, some years are dry, some are a little bit warmer than the long-term average, some are a little bit cooler. But as we move through time, the climate regime of our winter rainfall region becomes something new. You can see that already by the middle of the century, almost every year is warmer. Every single year is warmer than the long-term average. And most of those years are also becoming dry. And what it means, what you can deduce immediately, is that the risk of subsequent years being dry or multi-year, the risk for multi-year droughts is obviously increasing. And it is a 3-year drought from 2015 to 17 that almost brought the day zero event to Cape Town. So that risk is clearly increasing. And if you really interrogate this graph, it actually suggests quite strongly that for as long as the city of Cape Town is going to rely only on the dams that has already been built, it's already maximally exploiting all their opportunities to build dams in the rivers that can provide the city with water. It can no longer grow sustainably. In this type of climate change future, which is one of these low mitigation futures, where we eventually reach 3 degrees Celsius of global warming, the city will need a new water resource if it wants to grow. And that water resource may be the most realistic option being suggested, but also an expensive one is, of course, desalination. There are other plans that are being suggested, for example, building a big dam at Uppington and channeling Orange Senku River water southwards to Cape Town. That's realistically being proposed. The next slide will show why that's a very bad idea. And the other possibility is towing icebergs to Cape Town. That has also been suggested by the engineers, but maybe also not such a realistic plan if you think about the thermodynamics of getting an iceberg that far to the north. Those are the desperate plans that were being proposed in the middle of the Cape Town drought. Now, since then, of course, they've had a few normal winters and they've escaped for the immediate future, at least, from the risk of a day zero drought. But the climate projections are quite clear that the risk of these types of droughts are only increasing, will only be increasing for as long as the world will be warming. So yes, the same result, exactly the same, except we're going back further back into the past using climate models. We've reconstructed the climate back to the pre-industrial past, as we define it here, 1850 to 1900. And you can see also for Katse Dam, natural variability. It's usually the El Niño years that are dry. It's usually the La Niña years that are wet. But once again, as we move through time, the system changes substantially. And once again, it's drifting towards what we've seen in the maps, a future regime substantially hotter. Here over the interior, you can see individual years, right at the end of the century in these low mitigation futures, reaching temperatures of 7 degrees Celsius higher than the pre-industrial average, or even more in some individual years. And most years are dry. So this is the other important message. Also in the summer rainfall region, the risk of multi-year droughts are becoming higher as we move deeper into the future. And that's the fundamental reason why it's not a good idea to try and allocate some of this water resource to Cape Town. It needs to supply Gauteng, the industrial heartland. Just think about what a day zero drought may mean for the Gauteng province and for South Africa. But that brings us then right to this discussion of tipping points. So now I'd like to conclude this talk by pointing out, by just giving 4 examples of unprecedented climate change events that may occur in South Africa already in the near term. In IPCC, we mean with that the next 20 years. It's a risk that already exists. These events can already occur in the next few years. But as the world warms, the risk will be increasing. And the first of these is the possibility of a so-called day zero drought in Gauteng. And I think there's already one drought that took us close to a major water crisis in Gauteng. And that was the 4-year-long drought that affected the mega dams in the east, including Katse Dam. And it culminated with the big El Niño event, the strongest El Niño event ever recorded by humans of 2015-16. And at the end of that drought, before it was broken in September 2016, the level of the Vaal Dam fell to be just about 25%. And I've heard in the past from around water engineers that should it have fallen to below 20%, then because of water quality reasons and also because of the engineering challenges in getting the water uphill to Johannesburg and Gauteng, it would have been a major water crisis. So once before, we got really close to a day zero type drought in Gauteng. I don't think that's sufficiently appreciated. And if you think about what that previous graphic has shown us, this risk is only becoming bigger for as long as we keep on pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and making the system warmer. So the second possibility of a regime shift, so the climate's shifting into a regime where these types of events become possible for the first time, has to do with two things that we may be taking for granted as Southern Africans: our cattle and our maize crop. So already back in 2018, the IPCC assessed that should global warming reach a value of 3 degrees Celsius, remember that's about 6 degrees Celsius in Botswana, we will see the collapse of the cattle industry. We will likely see the collapse of the cattle industry. It's purely because of heat stress in large mammals. In a world where the regional climate system is on the average 6 degrees Celsius warmer than what it's supposed to be. And remember, on top of that will be the heat wave event of summer. So just try to imagine cattle. Try to imagine Botswana, where 70% of the people still have some dependency on cattle, without any cattle. In 2015-16, at the end of that drought, Botswana lost 40% of its cattle. And you may remember also in South Africa, we had tens of thousands of cattle dying in the northwestern parts of, or the northern parts of KwaZulu-Natal, right through the Limpopo province, and especially in the Northwest province and in the Northern Cape. So already we've seen the fingerprints of these types of unprecedented, long-lasting droughts combined with heat waves in the warmer world. The drastically warmer, likely drier future brings the possibility of the collapse of this major industry. So that's another example of a tipping point. Now, at the same time, the maize crop is vulnerable to these types of droughts. So the summer of 2015-16 was the driest summer on record in the Northwest and Free State provinces. So the records go back to about 1900. Driest summer on record, the maize crop in that season was 40% less than in the previous season. Now, due to the peculiarities of the maize plant, its tipping point is also thought to be sitting at about 3 degrees Celsius of global warming, which is about 6 degrees Celsius of global warming. So unmitigated global warming means Southern Africa, somewhere in the second half of the century, without maize and without cattle, it will be a different regional world. But we do think at the Global Change Institute that if we don't think purely about the biophysical impacts of heat waves combined with drought, but we also think about the socioeconomics of farming, these two industries may become unsustainable long before we reach 3 degrees Celsius of global warming. So how many of these multi-year droughts can a farmer live through before he or she gives up and moves to a different region or to a city? So quite likely, if we bring in the socioeconomics of farming, the tipping point sits maybe at 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, or somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius. That's an area of active research right now at our institute. The third example is about another effect of heat, namely the effect that extreme heat waves have on us as humans. So let me give you the example of something completely unprecedented that happened last year at the end of June in the Pacific Northwest. That part of the world, the northwestern states of the US and British Columbia and Canada, experienced a completely unprecedented heat wave. Specifically in an area where the average June temperature is about 25 degrees Celsius. Temperatures were recorded for a period of about 3 to 6 days, depending on where you were. that were well above 40 degrees Celsius. And in one location, Lytton in British Columbia, a temperature of just below 50 degrees Celsius was recorded in a place where the average June temperature is 25 degrees Celsius. And the latest estimates is that more than 500 people, or that more than 500 people died in that heat wave in the Pacific Northwest, simply because the people there are not used to this type of heat, and they don't have air conditioning. So they were extremely vulnerable when this unprecedented heat wave struck. Now come back to South Africa and Southern Africa. Most of our people don't have air conditioning. On top of that, so many of our people live in informal housing. Now, when a heat wave strikes and you live in informal housing, obviously you don't have air conditioning. If you also don't have easy access to cool water, if you are, for example, an elderly person and your children are not close by to help you, this is literally life-threatening. Now, the last startling fact is that climate models are clear. Climate change projections are clear that already in the next 10 years, we will experience unprecedented heat waves of unprecedented duration and intensity in Southern Africa. We had the first examples in the big El Niño drought of 2015-16. I don't think we appreciate how devastating this can be. Direct impacts on human mortality should these intense heat waves strike our region in a future warmer world. It's a risk of the immediate future. And then finally, a completely different type of tipping point. For the very first time in the historical record, the climate regime may shift to a new system where it for the very first time becomes possible that a category 4 or 5 hurricane can reach Maputo in the south. Now, just 3 years ago, we had the first instance of a category 4 hurricane reaching Beira. And the people of Beira are generally used to landfalling tropical lows and cyclones of category 1 status, but they were not prepared for a category 4 hurricane. And it was an immense tragedy when this cyclone struck. It happened to make things worse, more or less in the middle of the night, more or less at midnight, on the 14th of March, 2019. Just in Beira alone, hundreds of people died from the storm surge, the wall of seawater that moved from the center of the storm into Beira. And then, of course, very, very quickly, the Bushre and Pungwe rivers were in flood. And in the end, more than 1,000 people died. In Mozambique, and then also in Zimbabwe, once again in mudslides, and also in Malawi. Now this, I think, too few people realize, is the worst flood disaster ever recorded in Africa, south of the equator. And what the IPCC report pointed out last year is that for the very first time, because of the warming sea surface temperatures in the Mozambique Channel, such a system can now survive further to the south and can potentially reach Maputo or even Richards Bay. So we have one example of a tropical cyclone reaching South African territory. I mean the eye of the storm that you can see there in the satellite picture, reaching South African territory. It was Cyclone Niño back in 1984. Once again, something my students generally don't know about, but some of our audience members today may also know about Cyclone Niño. But that was a devastating event for South Africa, but in today's classification of cyclones, that system would not even be classified as a category 1 hurricane. So what will happen if a category 4 or 5 hurricane reaches Maputo for the first time, or reach as far south as Richards Bay, or even move into the Limpopo River? These systems bring winds of 200, sustained winds blowing at 200 kilometers an hour. If you live in informal housing, it's unsurvivable. And then depending on where you are, the storm surge and flooding can, of course, further destruction. So this is yet another completely different type of tipping point we need to be prepared for. For the very first time, the climate system may shift into a regime where this becomes possible. So let me conclude by showing two slides. The first is just to point out that the Global Change Institute is now having a very specific focus on climate change tipping points in the Southern African region. I can announce tonight that we've just obtained a major grant that brings together a number of partners from across Southern Africa, and it's funding from Germany and BMBF funding. There are also strong German partners involved, and we are going to focus on exactly these key tipping points, three of the tipping points I've mentioned, namely the possibility of day zero droughts in the African interior cities, the risk to cattle and the maize crop in specifically Botswana and South Africa and Zambia. And then, of course, also impacts on biodiversity. So we must also think about conservation, of course, when multi-year droughts strike and animals, for example, cannot migrate across country boundaries and between different parts. So it's very much a project that is going to look at the potential risks of events of unprecedented impacts in the context of droughts lasting longer than ever before, in the presence of more intense heat waves than what we've experienced in the historical past. We do have other funded projects and research programs focusing on these different risks in the East. So it's quite amazing that although the system on the average becomes generally drier, in the eastern parts we should at the same time prepare for more intense periods of heavy rainfall. So the very last slide is making a very deliberate attempt to say something positive at the end of such an outlook of really tremendous risks we have to deal with. And that is first and foremost that we should not be surprised or caught by surprise by these tipping point type of events, as I think happened with the Cape Town drought. We were not prepared, but actually the science was there telling us that it's possible. So climate science is sufficiently advanced to give us what we call actionable messages for adaptation. We know our number one risk in this region is a region that becomes generally drier, drastically warmer, with the additional risk of more intense rainfall events in the east. We can prepare for these risks to some extent. Eventually, of course, there are limits to adaptation, biophysical limits, where the cattle industry collapses. But it's not too late to prevent that from happening. As we are meeting here today, it's still in humanity's control to prevent the most dangerous levels of global warming from occurring. The IPCC report has assessed that it's probably too late for us to avoid the 1.5 degrees Celsius level of global warming. It's now more likely than not that we will exceed it, even if we do everything right now in terms of the just transition to renewable energy. We are more likely than not to exceed that limit. But if we do everything right, the chances are excellent that we can still restrict global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. Every bit of global warming we can prevent from occurring will give us benefits in the form of reduced impacts. So there's still hope for climate change mitigation. I think we can all think of how realistic it is that in today's geopolitics, we will see strong action in the next 10 years. So we do need to curb emissions substantially in the next 10 years to at least avoid a 2 degrees Celsius threshold of global warming. But that gives us hope. We still have a chance to undertake strong climate change mitigation across the planet, and we can prepare for the additional warming that can no longer be prevented, at least to some extent. So the IPCC is really trying to present the science under the banner of reasons for hope, and I think that's what we also should do. And as Southern Africans, we should prepare to the extent that we can for these risks that will be growing in the warmer world. And with that, Grant, I hope it's a somewhat positive tone, and I hope we have time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now I think we do have some time for a bit of discussion and questions, both formally and informally, after the talk. So thank you both, Craig and Francois, for that. Really appreciate it. I'm going to ask if anyone in the audience has any questions or comments. See, there are a number of people on Zoom, and I just want to make sure you're able to unmute yourself. So if you do have a question, you can raise your hand, as Lou Ashwell has already done. So we'll take Lou's question first, and the person who answers the question may just have to come back to the microphone, because otherwise the Zoom audience won't hear you. So Lou, go for it. You are able to unmute.
Okay, thanks, Grant. Listen, fellas, both of you, thanks for 2 terrific talks. I have 2 simple-minded questions for the first speaker, who I profoundly forgive for being an engineer. I forgot his name, but I think it might be Sheridan.
Craig.
Yes, okay, good, Craig. So, hi. So my first question is, it occurs to me that some of the ideas you have for creating more circularity in ore processing and mineral production, this kind of thing, some of them are going to produce carbon dioxide, especially if you use limestone. And if this turns out to be significant, it's going to horrify the second speaker, Professor Engelbrecht. So, can I ask my second question?
Sure.
Okay, the second question is, in order for these ideas of yours to be implemented, you're going to have to get buy-in from the industries, and so I'm wondering if you have thought about what benefits there might be for a mining company to do some of this stuff. Is it going to save them money? Is it going to save them manpower? So those are my 2 simple-minded questions.
So I don't think either are simple-minded, so thank you for them. The first one is the addition of the limestone in the steel industry. I guess that's happening anyway. So yeah, we've got to mitigate against that CO2, and I think that's a really important point. For me, what we're doing is, if the impact is there, what can we then do to use that product again afterwards? So rather than using the lime, let's use the slag for the pH neutralization, because we have to do that anyway. So that is a mitigation in itself, rather than burning other limestone to create new lime. We've already done that once. Let's try and reuse that material. So I guess it's the reuse concept. The second question, yeah, Lou, this is a really difficult one, and it's not one that I'm necessarily good at, is to drive these discussions back into industry. So this project has an industrial partner, and I think they're really interested in the project specifically because of that one acid mine drainage facility or dam, which is so highly impacted. I think they really want this to work because they want a solution to this problem, which is called, the dam is called headache in Afrikaans. So I guess there is buy-in, but again, the buy-in is very strongly caveated against the additional expenses of building a new process plant, which is a continuous drain on the mining house's fiscus or their bottom line. And it's around part of what we will have to demonstrate at the end of this project is that there's opportunity for a small industry or an SMME to come in and actually to do the treatment and to make money and take that liability away from the mining site at the same time as keeping themselves economically sustainable. That's the win. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm able to get there, but again, if I don't try, we're not going to get there. But your points are absolutely valid, Lou, totally valid.
Thank you, Lou. I wonder if one, perhaps as a comment to that, and something I thought about during the talk, and maybe directed to Francois here, is it one way of perhaps convincing industries of how beneficial the circular economy may be to adapting to climate change, for instance, or tipping points, has anyone modeled how implementing circular economies could affect tipping points? How could they reduce tipping points? Is that something that can be quantified and modeled and convince people? That seems to me the best way of convincing people is to say this particular process might do it. Of course, you have to do it on a global scale. So Francois, perhaps you have some comments to that, and then we can take a few more questions from the audience.
Sure, Grant. So let me point out that the projections I've been sharing tonight are, of course, mostly for so-called low mitigation futures, where we fail to set up sustainable economies moving into the future. So these tipping points do occur when global warming reaches a value of 3 degrees Celsius or 4 degrees Celsius, especially if we look now only at biophysical impacts. And as I've explained, because of socioeconomic considerations, some industries may well collapse at lower levels of global warming. But if we should look at economies that undergo a revolution globally, specifically phasing out fossil fuels and making this revolution towards generating on the planet in renewable ways, then if we can restrict global warming to at least 2 degrees Celsius, and preferably still below 2 degrees Celsius, we indeed will likely avoid many of these regional tipping points. But there are other tipping points where the level of global warming required to reach them may be at about 1.5 degrees Celsius. Most well-known and important is the irreversible melting of the Greenland ice sheet. That tipping point, that's now a global, so-called global tipping point, will likely sit somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. So isn't that a staggering reality? We will initiate the irreversible melting of the Greenland ice sheet. Now that ice sheet will of course take several millennia to melt away completely, but it's 6 meters of sea level rise. And at the same time, the West Antarctic ice sheet, its point of instability is not as well understood, but it's possibly also somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. That's another 6 meters of global sea level rise. So it means that our generation, by having left this climate change mitigation process for too long, may actually have stolen living space from future generations. The planet becomes literally smaller and less habitable, even under 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. So even if we do everything right in terms of a powerful, coordinated international mitigation effort, including sustainable and circular economies, some tipping points may already not be avoidable. That's a hard thing to realize in 2022. But I think in Southern Africa, it's very clear that the risk of multi-year droughts and heat waves increase almost linearly as the level of global warming increases. So every bit of global warming we can prevent from occurring will reduce some of these impacts occurring in the Southern African region. So for us, there's still very, very good reasons to, as Southern Africans or as the Africa group in negotiations, strongly advocate for a strong mitigation effort to happen globally to the benefit of Africa. And that's also why it's important for African countries to do their fair share in reducing emissions. And for us not to grow our economies using fossil fuels, but to make use of the international convention to rather convert our economies into renewable energy fueled economies. I hope that's a bit of an indirect answer at least.
Thank you, Francis. I think we have one question from Henry. Henry, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thanks, Chair. Henry Roman from the DSI, Department of Science and Innovation. Thank you for the talk. It's very fascinating and something that's been occupying my time for a while. And the Chair kind of stole my question because I was going to ask a similar question. However, there's a few things, and one, so water, climate change, circular economies, these things are all related, and mine is more of a comment than a question in that we can almost map industrial development from the Industrial Revolution, link it to our increasing climate effects based on carbon emissions. A circular economy is touted, especially by as a regenerative economy and contribute to the regeneration of biodiversity on the planet as well. Because by the nature of how you do circular economy processes, improving your use of resources without taking more natural resources in that process, thereby regenerating your biodiversity spaces. And in the water space as well, with climate change, we have to think about how do we store our water. The way we design dams in South Africa is very inefficient when you're looking at increasing temperatures. We're going to have increased evapotranspiration. We have these big, shallow dams. We need deeper dams. Or we need to think more about how do we recharge aquifers where the water won't evaporate from. So a number of things, and I'd like to extend an invitation to Francois and Craig for myself to maybe come down and have a coffee with them, because there's a number of things that we can discuss in areas of interest that the DSI is looking into. And just in closing, one of the things I'm working on is the development of a science, technology, and innovation for the transition to a circular economy roadmap for South Africa. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Henry. That's great. And that's exactly what these talks are about, right? Trying to connect people within the earth sciences and within science more broadly. Are there any questions in the room very quickly before we end off?
Can I say something in
yeah,
to Henry?
Of course.
Henry, it's exactly right. And thanks for pointing that out. And for me, the tragedy of the commons is reversed in the same way that the tragedy occurred. It's one person at a time, one process at a time, one home at a time, one event at a time. And it's every small win has to be counted and noted. And that's the way, the big ones are really important, but I think we should never discount the small ones, because that's the reversal of the tragedy of the commons. And it's what you said. So thank you.
Super.
Yeah.
Yes, we'll let Francois conclude.
Thanks, Henry. What I would like to add is that there are tremendous opportunities also in the transition, in technological solutions. That's part of the transition. And something we haven't mentioned tonight is the possibility of so-called carbon dioxide removal technologies. So surprisingly, if we do want to stand a chance of avoiding the first tipping point, we still want to stand a chance of not reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. We need to invent technologies that can remove some of the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it away safely. Now, these technologies are currently being pursued across the world, but nobody has something that can really scale. So there are tremendous opportunities for us as African researchers and innovators to play a role in this transition. If we think about scalable solar farms and wind farms, there are still major technological advances to be made. And if we think about the carbon dioxide removal technologies we need, maybe even if we overshoot 1.5 degrees Celsius to get back to that safer level, we can still take a leading role as African innovators in inventing these types of technologies. So there are wonderful opportunities as well, and we certainly need to be part of that part of the science here in Africa.
Great. Well, thank you very much to everyone. Thank you to everyone who joined us on YouTube. There were about 20 people on YouTube and about 20 people on Zoom as well, and several people in the audience. So thank you so much. This is the start of, as I said, these Earth Science Frontiers seminars, and I hope we can develop this further once a quarter here at Wits University and develop more momentum. So thank you both for being the inaugural speakers here, and we look forward to more of these talks. And if anyone wants to get in contact with any of the speakers, you'll find their details on the Wits website. You can also join our mailing list just by visiting the Wits Geosciences webpage, and you'll get updates about these talks. And I think one of the future talks that we have here on a Thursday afternoon will be from someone in the Council of Geoscience, David Causer, speaking about carbon capture, in fact, I think in September. So it'll be lovely to develop more of these conversations and make it more organic. So thanks, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you at the next set of talks. Thank you.